The Big Light presents
when you kind of go through this experience where it was very kind of touch and go, it does leave like an emotional scar. Like it does leave that kind of emotional kind of trauma. And, I did kind of notice myself like getting really kind of sometimes really kind of just wound up.
My name is Halina and this is the A Sonic Hug podcast. Over the coming episodes, you're going to hear the voices of people from different walks of life who deal, experience and battle mental health issues. In this episode, I speak to Ica Headlam. Based in Aberdeen, Ica is a creative practitioner, podcaster and founder of We Are Here Scotland. I know Ica as a friend and also have the pleasure of working with him. I didn't know about how tough his journey has been since contracting COVID, which has led to serious health complications, including long COVID, but also the impact it's had on his mental health. This is Ica's story.
Do you know what? I think my mental health has just kind of been, over the past couple of years, in all honesty, quite all over the place. There's been periods when I've kind of felt really kind of settled and, within myself. But then, there's equally, I guess, the impact of what I'm going to speak about comes in kind of peaks and troughs. And there's obviously bits where there's ups and downs. And that's kind of like the impact on like my physical health and having an impact on your physical health for me ends up kind of resulting in obviously difficulties with mental health sometimes. For me, the kind of like experience in having COVID for the very first time, or just all around in general, it's been kind of very challenging, confusing in terms of this unknown kind of virus that's kind of just attacking your body and there's nothing you can really do about it as well. So for me, as a black man living in Scotland, originally from London, I remember at the height of the pandemic, a lot of black and people of colour were going into hospital and going into care and not getting back home to their families and loved ones. So, the first experience when I had COVID, it was scary, a lot of uncertainty. I remember there's this kind of cultural thing as well of like my wife who is white and like my family from the African Caribbean kind of like background were like, why did like I could go to hospital when stuff like people like are dying in hospital? And then my wife who's an advanced nurse practitioner is going like, well, this is the best place for him. But I think like the cultural kind of perspective was like, no, just ride this out at home, do the kind of old remedies and like herbal kind of remedies to kind of take care of yourself and stuff like that. When I think about this kind of whole experience, clearly a lot of like uncertainty. I remember the first time when I had COVID having to call NHS 24 and it was a video assessment with a consultant and said, oh yeah, you need to go into like the hospital. And the whole kind of just general experience, because at the time my wife had COVID and definitely saw that our 1-year-old daughter then had COVID as well. And I remember the paramedic coming in and he's kind of holding me and was like, oh, it can't be asked with this. And my wife was at the top of the stairs and I was in the living room and he's just kind of like, rolling his eyes all that, almost like, oh, here we go. And, you kind of feel like even from then and like that initial experience of being a bit dismissed, and it kind of ties into like the whole kind of like my life since I've had COVID and living with long COVID. But that whole experience was just challenging in that some people were just thinking like, this paramedic obviously didn't even want to be there. Saw me sitting on my sofa and, I don't know how I managed to do this, but I managed to walk into the ambulance. And when I ended up getting to Aberdeen Royal Infirmary, I passed out and I have little kind of bits and pieces of that memory and this kind of this feeling really horrible and it's like this unexplainable kind of this kind of fear and uncertainty. And I remember when I got back home after the hospital, I was in the hospital for like 6 days. My wife was saying that like, my daughter who's just turned 1 a few weeks prior to that was like waving, daddy, go in an ambulance. And I didn't see that. And I kind of, not to get too emotional about it, but I kind of felt like, oh, that could have been the last time my daughter would have seen me, and then, she probably would have no real solid memory of me. The whole kind of like experience from being in hospital, it was kind of scary. A lot of kind of like uncertainty when I was there. I lost a lot of weight, and then I kind of developed what they called back then was COVID pneumonia, and also sepsis, a little bit of sepsis in my left leg. And it was just kind of like a lot of confusion. And I think this is a thing that people don't kind of, people, you can easily take for granted that, we kind of do run-of-the-mill things like in our day-to-day life. But when something's out with your control and impacts on your health in a very serious kind of way, it is scary, and it does impact on your mental health. And I think for me, when I was in the hospital, I was just desperate to get home and to be in my family. In the back of my mind, I always had the thought, okay, if this gets worse, I just want to be at home. I just want to die at home with my wife and my child. And I guess the whole big part of it, that whole kind of bit of you're letting people know, now I was in the hospital and I was getting a little bit better before I got home. I was letting people know, oh yeah, by the way, I had COVID and stuff like this. And I think back then it was like that kind of thing of like, it sounds very strange to say this, but like you feel like, if you almost have like the plague, and then you kind of say to people, oh yeah, by the way, I've got COVID. A lot of really close friends were really supportive, and they were really just like, saying, oh, what can we do? Let us know if Beth and your daughter need any help and stuff like that. And it was really kind of nice to actually have those people as well. And that also kind of had a positive impact on my mental health, was that people were just rooting for me to get better and get home to my family. But since the first time having COVID and getting the chance to kind of like finally get home, it was such a relief, especially for like my mental health, to actually be in a familiar place. And I think as well, like, hospital, the ARI and the ward, the respiratory ward, they were amazing. And they got me back home to my family. I can't thank them enough for that. But, even that people say that saying, there's no place like home. I was just so glad and relieved to get home and see my family. You have these kind of experiences, you can like, and easily say, people say, oh God, like, God, I feel like I could have died, and, and it's been never kind of close to that. But literally for me, it was that part where I remember when I got to go home, and the consultant on the ward round before I left was kind of had a really kind of like, nice conversation with me, and it's going like, it's really good that your wife kind of told you to kind of call in that day and stuff, on that Tuesday, that late April, because I think if you left it, we probably wouldn't be having this kind of conversation. And it does kind of hit you there. And people say like someone's looking down, or like there's someone protecting you and stuff. But I feel like for me, that in that whole process of calling NHS 24, and then speaking to a consultant within half an hour later, then a paramedic, the ambulance coming around probably like, half an hour, 40 minutes later, all in that kind of succinct way. I was very lucky in comparison to other people who weren't so lucky in probably living in like larger cities across the UK. But yeah, it's kind of like a combination of all those kind of things, the fear of somebody not valuing your life, probably like the paramedic, and that kind of like dismissive attitude, but also that big part of, I don't want to die, I want to live. You want to shine, like this is something obviously like life and death we have like no control over. Our death, when your time's up, your time's up. But in that kind of panic, or in that kind of circumstances, your mind does race. You do get kind of really scared and a bit fearful. I remember actually, I want to laugh about this, but when I was in the hospital and I was still kind of confused, I think it was like the first night, and there was a nurse praying over me, this really nice Nigerian lady, and I forgot her name. But when you're half dazed and you see someone praying over you, I was thinking like, Jesus, like, am I kind of like crossing over or something? What's going on? But she gave me really nice reassuring words, and saying like, she was just praying for me, and and that she's had COVID before, and and she was very kind of encouraging, and said, oh, you have to fight this, you have to fight this, you have to fight this to get home to your family. So there's been such a kind of this like thing when I think about it, that kind of bit of that fear of death, but also knowing whereas it's like, you're teetering, you feel like you're teetering on that edge, that someone can be encouraged to be like, oh no, fight this, don't give up, so there's been some challenges with it. It's still kind of scary to speak about and think about, but also that kind of positives where even like, a nurse was praying over me when I was like half asleep and out of it. And then there's me thinking that the end is near. After the first experience of COVID, I've always been quite an anxious person. I know that from a young age, and even like my mum would say that, I always had kind of a bit of that anxiety. Things had to be a certain way. I had to be somewhere at a certain time. And I get really worked up if things weren't working out. in the way I wanted to. So when like that whole bit of like getting COVID for the second time, I was very fearful because everyone has different kind of perspectives and attitudes towards COVID. But for me, it was that, oh shit, I don't want to go to the hospital again. I'm scared, and it does have an impact on your mental health because straight away you go to that kind of fight or flight kind of mode in your head of like, right, okay, I need to go and isolate for my family. I tell my wife, okay, I'll go in the spare bedroom, and there's my daughter who wants to kind of play and hug me, and I'm just like, oh no, just like keep your distance and stuff like that. And you have to call in sick at your work, and then you're thinking like, I guess like for me, it's like that kind of part of that mental health of like anxiety and all that paranoia, thinking that your work will probably assuming that you're just taking the piss, but it's almost like no, you create this kind of narrative in your head of like complete like untrue paranoia and anxiety about the situation. But it was that kind of bit of just me being really scared, even in that lead up to before I got COVID again, and just like being mindful of like my surroundings and kind of being like, oh, do I want to go to this group event, or I'm not really sure how many people are going to be there. So you kind of thinking like even in those public and social situations as well. And I'll say this openly, there's a lot of kind of times in between from the second time I got COVID where I was just kind of like this counseling, catching up with people, like planned kind of times, kind of catch up with mates and stuff. And I was just like probably making excuses because I was a bit anxious about just going out in big open spaces again. For people that know me close, people, and this is probably like for me kind of like saying this out in public, but I've been going to counseling off and on since 2015. For lots of kind of different reasons, but because through like my therapist just developed like a good kind of that professional working relationship, I was able to kind of just touch base with her when I came back from hospital, and for the first time I had COVID, and just kind of working through the bits of like the anxiety, the bits that I can control for myself, and the parts that I can't control that are more or less out with my control. And I think that's definitely kind of helps me and giving me some perspective about having COVID, living with long COVID, and all the kind of like the little kind of like in between like things, or like the parts that in terms of like actually what impact on like one's like mental health. So there's times when like have to kind of take a step back, kind of like rationalize just through that kind of like the therapy sessions. Okay, this is what this is actually is. This isn't like, don't need to worry about going into like, big kind of like public kind of settings and stuff like that, and for me, one of those kind of parts as well, like, and like, for me, it's like getting like the vaccines when they first kind of came out. Like, obviously, there's that kind of also the discussion or debate about a lot of Black and people of color not really engaging with the kind of vaccine that was put out. Like, was it like, I think it was like started like early last year. And you get all the kind of conspiracy theories and stuff like that. And I think for me, that people should be mindful of this as well. Like when you got like, chat groups on like with friends and like family, I noticed that a lot of this disinformation comes out of these kind of WhatsApp groups as well. And that equally has an impact on like, my kind of mental health or anxieties, because people are sharing lots of this more, it's kind of like right wing kind of rhetoric about, trackers and stuff going into like vaccines and like depopulation kind of vaccines and stuff like that. And you got to think like, I've actually had to kind of be quite vocal with some friends and family and say, don't send me this stuff because I find it just like really triggering, this kind of like just like problematic, like, and then you actually kind of like you find yourself doing a deep dive yourself and having to kind of show them like where you're actually getting this kind of source from and stuff like that, where you're getting this information. Because there's that part as well where everyone becomes like a medical professional by just going on Google. And that's also kind of challenging because people will, over the years, past couple of years, have been saying, oh yeah, just do A, B, C, and D. Yeah, because this is where it is like, it's just like a flu, kind of stuff. So therefore, this is what you need to do and you'll get better. But now for me, instead of making that affect me, get to me, I just kind of sometimes just go, oh, okay, cool, thanks, and just keep it moving because I know what I kind of go through and what I probably still have to go through, even living with long COVID as well. I have held back from showing my fear of this, just from that bit of, being a Black male as well, from an African Caribbean background. You're not really supposed to be, speaking about, mental health or like showing your emotions. And I've kind of I've learned to kind of this debunk that a long time ago. So for me, I think there was that kind of bits of not being open and honest with my wife about how I was kind of feeling, and that kind of like, I guess like the whole experience is like that kind of trauma it's kind of left with me with. And I know hopefully people probably rolling their eyes and be like, "Oh, yeah, you just had COVID, mate, settle down." But when you kind of go through this experience where it was very kind of touch and go, it does leave like an emotional scar. Like it does leave that kind of emotional kind of trauma. And, I did kind of notice myself like getting really kind of sometimes really kind of just wound up, even at home or at work, and finding that, yeah, like, why am I feeling like this? Am I feeling like I'm having like an anxiety attack or a panic attack? And it took me a while to kind of just say to my wife, look, I'm really feeling in a really kind of like difficult kind of place. And, prior, to me even having COVID, and as I mentioned before, going to therapy, she's, been amazing. So she knew how to kind of support me in the right way. And that definitely, helped as well. I think like in the day job, I just keep it very kind of professional as well. And, and I think that's kind of like, because in my job where I work with like vulnerable young people, I have to have my like corporate parent head on as a social worker, and and make sure I'm supporting them as much as possible. But it took me a while to recognize that, oh yeah, you can be vulnerable with the people that love you and care about you. That's okay. For me, like the after effects of like having COVID is that I have long COVID. I have pneumonia scarring on my left lung just through having COVID pneumonia. God, I can't count how many times I've been to the hospital since I've had COVID with chest infections. Had a really bad chest infection a couple of times last year, but I felt like, it's just like a heart attack, and had, antibiotics for that. And then in the hospital again for a really bad infection of the mastoid bone, which is the bone area behind your ear. So this is on the right side. So that was kind of difficult. So I was in hospital again for a couple of days last year. Another this night this year, earlier in the year as well. So like my immune system is quite kind of just vulnerable to getting colds and getting chest infections. Go regularly to do a spiritual ward in Aberdeen, just to do like checkups and stuff and take bloods. Even since having COVID as well, one of the strangest things that I ever kind of like developed is like type 2 diabetes, but they say like borderline type 2 diabetes. But I took medication for that last year, but because I think it's more or less like on an even kill now, I don't need to take any more medication for that. But that was kind of scary as well, because there's some kind of like new studies and saying that whether like having COVID-19 has kind of triggered like type 2 diabetes. I think a lot of studies in America are focusing on that, but the hospital thought like, well, can't really explain it, but it's saying, well, you're from a African Caribbean background, and people from African Caribbean or Asian background are more predisposed to having type 2 diabetes. And my grandfather had that as well on my mum's side. So yeah, I think for me, like all these kind of like physical ailments absolutely impact on my mental health, because there's that other part of it as well. You think like, right, there's things that I could do before that now I can't really do now. Like there's things I've got to be mindful about. Okay, like do not exert yourself too much, like even today speaking like to the doctor and saying, well, like, you've got a left lung that's probably, not working. So like you've got to be mindful about how you kind of go about, taking care of yourself, especially in the times of like in winter when there's actually colds and flus and stuff going about. So for me, it's just like, not I don't want to say like be defeatist about it, but it's almost like, right, I've got to try and have a positive attitude about it. Look, I'm still here. I feel so much lucky in comparison to other people who are living with long COVID, or people who've lost loved ones due to like COVID. So for me, even though it does impact my mental health, I still have to try and take a positive attitude towards it, to be like, look, I'm still here. My daughter didn't have to wave goodbye to me 2 years ago and not see me again. I can still get home to my family. So even though sometimes it does impact on my mental health, I have to take that step back and just stop and be like, Ica, your life still has purpose, and you can do something positive and meaningful in your life. It used to get me really frustrated when people, even people I kind of just respected and followed, especially in the creative community, and some people being like sharing all these kind of like conspiracy theorists kind of in trying to convince that, like we're all being controlled, mass control and stuff like that. And I used to get really worked up and angry and pissed off. And now I just kind of look at it and just laugh at it now. I can't take it seriously because I kind of feel like, right, I'm speaking from my experience, and like me, my wife had COVID. I've known lots of family and friends who've had COVID since as well. The pandemic, started. That my lived experience is that I had COVID, and some people saying, well, I've had it and, I haven't felt that bad, but each their own. Everyone experiences this in different ways. So for me, I'm just like, right, you stay in your lane, I stay in my lane, and it has kind of also kind of made me think about, right, it always, you take someone for face value and you be like, I thought that person was really sound. But then you realize that, okay, everyone has different thoughts and kind of theories. But when I see a lot of people sharing stuff about conspiracy theories or like COVID deniers, I'm thinking like, well, that's my kind of view, is that like the pandemic has impacted on them in a different way. At the start of the pandemic, okay, they're just trying to stay safe as possible. I actually believed it was a thing, and then some people didn't. And for me, I think like it's just impacted on people and their mental health in different ways. For me, when I see that kind of stuff now, I do find it kind of comical, but I actually kind of feel like I don't need to engage with them. I don't need to actually kind of have a debate with them, just to kind of give them the airtime. I think like, that kind of this almost feeds into that kind of mass paranoia that some people kind of have, and saying like, someone messaged me and they said they had COVID and stuff, and like in a smartest way, take a step back from it, because I think it just will have a negative impact on my mental health. I wasn't surprised there wasn't kind of like, more engagement or support for the Black and POC community in the UK. For my, this experience of growing up in the UK and being a Black man, that the UK, I guess, like in lots of different kind of like systems and organizations have lots of issues in terms of actually, representation, but also kind of like seeing us as a community, as people or valued, members of the community. I think this was some of the things that I saw of like, frontline workers, especially those of color, even when they were trying to call for support to be taken into hospital, that wasn't afforded to them. But, you got someone like, was like, former Prime Minister Boris Johnson probably getting the best kind of like NHS kind of care. And it's, for me, this shows me that there's so much more work to kind of do in terms of actually support for our community across many fields. But I think it was quite this shocking. I think my experience, I think it's been really good from like, NHS Grampian. I couldn't fault them. Anything they've done, they've been really like good and nice and kind and supportive to me. But for other people, I'm sure, of like Black and people of colour across Scotland and the UK, I'm sure they probably have lots more kind of like interesting and obviously difficult kind of like stories of what they've experienced. I think for me, if I could go back and speak to my younger self, it'd be two things I think I'd say is actually, don't be scared. Yeah, don't be scared to speak to people. Don't be scared to share how you're feeling, because if you don't do that, or you're not able to do that, you'll find things, very, very difficult.
That was Ica's story. I guess the first thing is perhaps sitting and thinking how much of an impact the prospect of death is, and facing that mentally, whether that be leaving people and not seeing them, the fear of going through the unknown, and the pain it might bring, but also things like the impact of leaving loved ones and your protection, guidance and love not being in their lives anymore. People I've spoken to, including Ica in these situations, have never thought about themselves solely. It seems to be the worry for others. But there is that strong theme of not experiencing those people in life again. COVID has been so polarising at times. The impact it's had on everyone is something that has been life-changing. Chloe, who spoke in my last episode about being a frontline worker during the pandemic, was one side of a horrendous few years, and Ica is coming from a different angle as a patient. His experience with the pandemic is really disheartening, and I guess on this podcast I try not to cast aspersions but ask questions and consider the impacts. So I wonder if that paramedic had been working constantly and was going through their own difficulties by not being treated fairly within their job or having complex things to deal with. But that domino effect onto Ica, then feeling dismissed, then carried that through. and so the cycle continues. However, to be on the edge of life and have that experience is really difficult to hear, especially from an angle of empathy. When Ica talks about this potentially being the last time he would see his family and taking things for granted is something we can all relate to. I suppose if we embrace life more and really take in our days, our loved ones, and nourish that, then it's inevitable that our mental health vastly improves. But it's not as simple as that. Ica mentions himself that there were other anxieties and aspects of his life, but that's where the importance of therapy came in and aided perspective, but also considered the complexities of layers that an event like COVID had brought other things to the surface. It's also important to remember Ica's comments about being a black man going through COVID. There are always several more barriers that a black person has to go through when it comes to an event like this. In this situation, one of the things Ica talks about is his family questioning his admission into hospital. So from a cultural perspective, there are rituals and long-standing historical approaches when it comes to health, but there is also consideration that Ica already has trauma relating to his experiences as a black man. So to exacerbate that with COVID and then adding things like conspiracy theories, people denying the gravity of your experience based on theirs, amongst other things, must be exhausting. The physical impacts of long COVID from Ica's story alone are terrifying. As humans, we can become anaesthetised to the struggles of others, particularly when we haven't experienced it ourselves. So for example, when we're hearing about the pandemic every day with its death and impacts such as pneumonia, sepsis and more, I think there were two main streams of thought. People started to feel as if it was normal, or people were terrified of that happening and it exacerbated mental health. So again, I think it's important to try and understand how hard it is for someone going through these things on a long-term basis, but also the associations that come with that mentally. The thought streams of, am I going to be okay? Is this ever going to end? Am I a burden on people? And so on. For Ica and others, I can't imagine the heaviness this weighs. Ica's a really selfless human. I know this from working with him and having a friendship with him. I don't think he'll mind me saying that I think he is very hard on himself at times, and I guess part of that is the impact of this illness and him not being able to do more. But I hope he shows himself more kindness as time goes on. And as he says, don't be scared to speak to people. I'm glad he spoke on this podcast and I really thank him, because that act alone will make people know they are not alone in this, but may encourage them to speak out too. If you have experienced or are experiencing anything described in this episode, you will find support information in the text to accompany this podcast. A Sonic Hug is recorded, edited and produced by me, Halina Rafai. We are also part of Scotland's podcasting network, The Big Light. Until next time, deep breaths.
From the Big Light Studio.